right, we got adoption of minutes.
I can motion to adopt the minutes, the meeting minutes.
I'll second.
Okay.
You need a vote on that, Chairperson?
Yeah, let's vote on this. I'm looking at it. It says, yeah, let's get a vote on that and accept that. Okay. Vote for the meeting of minutes.
Aye.
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 All in favor? Any extensions? All right, I guess we can pass those. And let's see. You know, I gotta work from two things. I can't work. I can't see this stuff on the screen, y'all, just so that y'all know. So actually, I'm on my computer reading this. So just so that y'all know.
We're at public
Yeah.
comments. I don't know that we have anybody for public comments. We just have our folks from Out With Studio to do the presentation for us. So they're on early. So if you see any extra folks, that's who they are. That's SD and June.
Okay. So no public comments. Okay.
So we can move into committees then. Finance would be first.
Okay. So, okay, finance, and let's see who's on for finance. Committee staff, director's report.
So I don't think we haven't met as the finance committee at all. Carlene is still our treasurer. She's not on the meeting just yet, but no huge updates, nothing that wasn't already covered in my director's report about the contracts. The budget was finalized for 2025 as it was presented in September by Mayor Gainey. So we did not get the ask that we were looking for, but we're going to continue to pursue that throughout the rest of this year to see if we can get a mid-year position swap and get that outreach person that we've been looking for.
So we did director's report.
Well, I can hop in and do the personnel report if that's helpful. Yeah, so from the personnel side, I think from the committee's perspective, no news is good news. We have not had any reason to sort of engage with staff in the office since our last meeting. And it's exciting to, continue to have a commission that's fully staffed. The only pending item continues to be Rachel's review, which is not pending for any other reason other than just like I need to open that Word document and deal with it. But yeah, other than that, life is good in the realm of personnel.
And then the Community Relations Committee didn't meet last month because it ended up falling during the holiday week. But I know that the commission has taken steps forward on initiating a complaint with the Greyhound stuff. So we'll see how that progresses.
Okay. So let's see. We did personnel. So are we on what, investigations?
We're ready for my report now.
Oh, okay. Director's report. Okay. All right. All you.
All right. Personnel and administration. I mean, personnel just reported, but the only other things that we had administrative wise was the Just Mediation Pittsburgh contract is fully executed. Finally, we did get materials to them. So should be in the process of distributing our fair housing materials to both the tenants and landlords that they see for their eviction mediation process. I haven't seen anything specific as an inquiry from that yet, but it's, we're just getting back from the holidays. I'm sure they'll be starting up business again soon. I think they took a little bit of a break there. They also lost their first executive director, so they have someone else standing in right now. And yeah, so we're looking forward to that, though. We do expect to see an uptick in housing cases based on the distribution of that outreach. We have the resolution was finally passed for Lewis Mietrower Consulting. So we are going to continue to try and get that contract done. It is, a lengthy process. We're trying to make it as short and sweet as possible, considering that this is the same exact contract for strategic planning that we had previously, just with a different named entity. So we're trying to work on that now. We have that money encumbered though, so we can continue with the strategic planning process. So just stay tuned for that. I might end up sending out some materials on that or requests to schedule so that we can move forward. And we secured officially one new volunteer mediator, and then I have another one on the books that we had to reschedule. But we're seeing an increase of interest in becoming a pro bono mediator for the commission. I think when people go to the Conflict Labs mediation training, I think they're drawn by the high number of CLE credits that they can get as an attorney. But then when they are exposed to all the different types of processes that they can see there, where it's not just their specific field of law, they are more open to experimenting with that. So we do have some folks that are longtime litigators that are interested in now doing mediations for the commission. And so we've oriented them and getting them in the rotation as well as we can, which is great because we often have a lot of mandatory conciliations where we have conflicted staff and just more than we can handle on a regular basis. So this is great news. Does anyone have any questions about the contracts that I mentioned? I know that I've kind of mentioned them in passing as we had smaller updates, but now that we're ready to go, I didn't know if anyone has any questions on any of that.
Yeah, Rachel, what is the timeline for strategic planning that's proposed in this new contract?
We're looking to add another year. So we have the funding that remained from the contract previously. We did add a bit of funding as well to add a couple of additional trainings and just group activities and some just consulting behind the scenes with the staff to try and keep things moving process wise. But it'll probably be another year, but we're looking to get that started as soon as possible. I know Amanda's eager to get this contract signed, so we just have to get it into DocuSign, and hopefully that'll be the kickoff officially.
Yeah, that would be great. It's just obviously the whole idea of strategic planning has been kicking around for so long through so many kind of iterations of the commission that it would be great to move ahead and actually have that happen.
Absolutely. And that was the push that I made for keeping Amanda and Lewis Mietrower instead of having to put it back out for a request for proposals and try to do this all over again. We've already gone so far, and by the time we would get someone else secured, we'll lose commissioners. And I want that perspective, the long-term commissioners, I want their perspective. So yeah, we'll see how quickly we can get this done now that we're in the first full week of January and we can have Courtney bug Matt every 2 days or so. So cases and enforcement, as of the very last day of the year, we had 49 open investigations, only 17 pending intakes. We've been able to get a lot of those cleaned up, thankfully, in the December period where we weren't seeing as many inquiries. So the intakes have gone down a bit. We do have 15 post-cause cases. 3 of them are in court, just kind of hanging out in settlement land right now. 12 pending mandatory conciliations. A lot of them are either in round 2 or had to be rescheduled because of the holidays. So that's why that number hasn't budged. And then we have 6 cases on the public hearing track. Where are we with scheduling? I think we only have 2 of those scheduled currently. And the one that we are likely to have continued this month, maybe just depending on what the circumstances are. We'll probably have to kick that one to March if that's what happens, but the January one, so we'll get that one in March. There's also another one in March currently, and then we're looking to schedule in April. So they have been getting adjusted. We haven't had an actual public hearing yet because we've had a lot of different things happening, but the progress is good, I think. And I'm really grateful for Falco over at Melo, Brungo and Melo for helping me through this process because it's just been a lot with how many we have on the docket currently.
Yeah, that's great. Can you just keep those of us on the public hearing track really apprised? I know that having those days completely blocked out on the calendar is a lot, and so the the more we can kind of be aware of what the scheduling looks like, the better.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm trying to make sure I have concrete information before I tell anyone anything, but you're right. Like I can always give you the idea that something might change so that if something needs to flex, then we can do that. So yeah, that's the update for now. I should have more for you by the end of this week.
Great.
And then we only have 7 determinations this month. One of them is a settlement. It just so happens to be the largest settlement that the commission has ever seen. So that's an interesting piece of compliance review. We also have a presentation for a commission-initiated complaint. So that's not something we've had for a while, but we've been working on this for some time, and it's ready to present. So CRS will get to vote on that today. Again, December super quiet. There was the vote on they were supposed to have the vote on the Allegheny County Human Relations Commission to update their portion of the code. They were trying to become substantially equivalent with both HUD and the EEOC so that they could take on those work sharing contracts, get the financial support that comes with that. And they ended up kicking it back to committee. So I don't know where that leaves them now, if they are going to continue moving with that process, if it's just stalled out at this point. I'm not sure. We're trying to coordinate a meeting with them to see how we can be helpful in the process, because we see so many, anything that's coming to us that's not jurisdictional is usually because of geography. And we want to be able to kick it to someone who actually has investigators to do the work and not just, sending it to an office where it's going to end up in a very long queue where people are not hearing anything for months at a time. So looking to move forward on that. I keep offering support, and when they're ready and they have staff, we're ready to help train them. So hopefully they'll take us up on that.
Yeah. What was the rationale for them not voting on it at their meeting? Like, what was the objections that were raised, I guess?
So objection wise, I don't know that there was even anything clear. It was just the president's decision to put it back to committee. And I believe that had something to do with some budgetary concerns from that portion of what the county had been dealing with. So I believe that's really the short and sweet answer, is that there were some hard feelings about the budget and they weren't going to pass anything that came from certain people because of that. So I don't think that there's any substantial change. It's the fact that they were trying to add to the budget. They wanted to add a director and at least 2 investigators, which is pretty substantial when you're going from nothing to a full-blown commission. So I imagine that the cost of that was probably the most prohibitive, considering the state that the county's currently in financially. I was also able to connect with Darius Wallace from the mayor's office to discuss our commissioner appointment needs. We went through the full list of different categories of things that we could really benefit from someone's expertise on. He is paying attention. I have been forwarding him anyone who sent me any commissioner suggestions thus far. Those have all been sent to him. Anything that came through back when Zeke Redeker was managing that for us, all of those had been sent to Darius as well. So he has everything at hand. If you have anyone else who might be interested, a suggestion for someone who might be good for them to reach out to, please send them our way, and then I can get it connected to Darius, or they can just apply directly. The last news that I had is that they had 5 applicants specifically for our commission that they were interviewing and reviewing to make sure that they were on the same page about what that entails. And then one more that was originally interested in the LGBTQIA plus commission and wanted to switch over to the commission because it would be a better fit expertise wise. So it's not terrible news. And I do have a follow-up meeting with Darius next week to check in and see where we are on all those.
Rachel, are there specific identified subject matter areas that we would be interested in filling?
Yes. So in the past, we've had people from various religious backgrounds, various ethnic backgrounds, different subject matter. And the subject matter really comes down to what protected classes are we protecting that are being unrepresented and we need to do more with. So we were actually in need of somebody for the LGBT space who's more directly focused on that. We were looking for someone in the police realm. So we used to have a retired police officer that was on the commission for a number of years, and the insight from that was really great. I'm trying to remember now what other things were. I mean, housing is a big one. I mean, I know you're here for that, but we used to have a number of people that were focused on housing because it is such an issue here in Pittsburgh. And yeah, I can get you the full list if you'd like, if there's anything that you'd like to focus on specifically, or see if you know anyone in those areas. But really, we'll take anyone who's really committed to doing this work.
No, that's fair. I would also say, I mean, I don't definitively know what everyone's expertise is that's currently on the commission.
Mhm.
So it might also be helpful just for the commission as a whole to have like just a rundown of what are the areas we look for, and then what would like to your point, I would consider myself a housing expert to some degree. I'm an expert on very little else other than that. But I'm sure that other folks here are experts on different things, carry different identities, et cetera. So it'd be helpful to just know where there are definitive gaps, so that we can help in that recruitment effort.
Yeah, for sure. I can get that list out to you. Maybe once I check in with Darius and I find out like what might be filled now, I can figure that out. But I did send him a number of different things. We've been looking for someone specifically dedicated to like the youth space. We did have that at one point with a commissioner who ended up not actually living in the city of Pittsburgh and had to resign. So we're just looking to fill some of those gaps of things that we've been working on. Anyone like the housing space, again, is just one that's just so large. We used to have a whole dedicated housing committee that ended up evolving into justice and equity, because it was just so much more than housing that was impacting the housing. And just the more people we have in those certain areas, the better. Yeah, but I can definitely share that with you all. Okay. For education and outreach, so chairperson and I participated in the press conference for the International Human Rights Day on December 10th. I decided to add photos to my director's report this month, so here you go. But there's Chair Collins. She was able to give some words on behalf of the commission, which is really great. Thank you for participating in that. We're looking to sit down with the Human Rights City Alliance sometime in the next month so that we can try to organize our thoughts around what goals we'd like to accomplish with regard to human rights this year. I think we've kind of just been flying by the seat of our pants for the last couple of years, and it's been really spontaneous requests for interaction. The potluck is a normal thing. A Fair Housing Month event is a normal thing, and then International Human Rights Day. But other than that, it's not very solid. So just trying to come together on that and make sure that we can support each other in the best way possible. We did have our third and final Fair Housing for Landlords training in December. Thank you, Rita, for taking on the presenting for that, because my plate was very full that week. But that was with Megan Hammond from Fair Housing Partnership. We've been offering these regularly throughout the 2024 so that we can get anyone who has a settlement with the commission with a training mandate to come to the table and actually fulfill that, and just to make it open to anyone and everyone who might be interested. And Chair Collins, you were actually there as well. Did you want to say anything about the training?
I thought the training was very informative. In fact, I ended up having to use some of that knowledge and reaching out to my girl Rita because I ran into some issues here where I live at. So that training really came in really handy. So I do appreciate the fact that I was able to attend and I paid attention. So I thank both Rita and I thank you guys for scheduling that. And any other trainings that you have in the future, I do plan on attending because you never know when I'm gonna need them or when I'm gonna need them to help somebody. So I'm grateful for it.
Yeah, we always say, like, if you can't use the information yourself, someone in your life probably can. So it really just helps to pass it on. So yeah, thanks for heading out for that. And then we're looking at doing an upcoming training for employment, but with the Western PA Employment Lawyers Association. Their new president reached out to me to see if we'd be interested. They often have different organizations come and present for their plaintiff focused staff, and they're really interested in the new medical marijuana protections that we have. So we're going to put something together on that. And I think this is actually scheduled now for February 5th, but I can't even quote myself right now because I'm in a fog from walking pneumonia, so I apologize. So we'll have that presentation. And then we're also looking at doing a Know Your Rights presentation this month with the Pittsburgh Hispanic Development Corporation. We're still trying to figure out the details on that. They had shifted a bunch from doing it just for their staff versus doing it for their their service population as well. They had originally asked us for a native Spanish speaker to present it and not to have an interpreter. So Alberto and I had been conversing about that, and he was going to get with me to do the presentation. So we're still looking to see what they want from us. I think they've switched it just to staff for now, and we'll have that trickle down effect that we've had with Know Your Rights presentations in the past. But I'm excited. It's been a while since we've done something more specific with PHDC, and they do great work. So I'm really happy that we can get connected with them. They have a whole new like housing sector now, a new housing person that's working over there. So she's very interested in having us come speak.
Excuse me, Rachel. I
Yes.
can't raise my hand. I'm not sure if I'm in as a participant, or what's going on, but I'm also a native level Spanish speaker if it's ever needed. I mean, certainly Alberto would be the better person to represent the commission, but I'm always happy to help with stuff like that.
Thank you for the reminder, because I had completely forgotten about that. But that's excellent that, I really want to be able to offer that to them. And I am not a native Spanish speaker. I have very minimal knowledge and cannot present on the commission. But I mean, I'm happy to work with anyone who would be interested in doing the presentation in Spanish so that I can get you up to speed on like what the presentation actually is explaining. I'm getting it translated so that we can offer it in both Spanish and Brazilian Portuguese for when we finally do have that, and they can, refer back to it as they need to. But yeah, thank you, Mary Jane. I appreciate that. Okay, and then with the special projects, so today we're going to have our presentation from June and Esty on our LGBTQIA plus housing project. So the survey is complete. They have analyzed the data to some extent, and they're going to give us some of the results of that. I found them to be really interesting, and I think it's going to really guide the work of the commission in the next year or two, and what we need to get up to speed on, and places that we need to be that we just weren't aware of before. And then the last thing on here is just the welcoming communities renting to immigrants presentation. So this was done a few years back. It was the renting to refugees. Now it's renting to immigrants. We want to open that up a little bit, but we're just trying to give information to landlords on, what are the benefits of renting to immigrants? Like, what service providers can you work with to get that support? How can you access interpretation and translation if you need to? What are your rights and responsibilities if you do this? And we're just trying to make it so it's a more welcoming environment for everyone, and for people to not be put off by someone's preferred language or national origin, etc. So that's finally getting scheduled. Oh, let me see. I don't have the link for it yet, but it is going to happen on Friday, February 7th at 11 a.m. It's going to be, I believe, entirely virtual if anyone's interested. And that's it from me today. Not as long. I'm hoping that's okay.
I was just sitting here thinking, like, wow, once you introduce Rachel, you just got to sit back and just let her do the meeting. It's okay. Thank you very much. Appreciate all of that. So we are now at, let's see, new business. You just went through everything else.
So we're in our old business where this would be the time where we can open up for Out with Studio to do the presentation. June and Esty,
Okay.
are you good?
Yeah, we are ready. I can share here. I'll send a request for that. Cool. All right. Well, thank you everyone for having us today. I'm June McCartan, principal at Out West Studio. We are a queer and trans-led urban planning and research consultancy, legally based in Philadelphia, but kind of all over. We have been very lucky, fortunate to be participating in the LGBTQIA housing rights research for CHR, and are really excited to share some results from that research today. I'm joined, by the way, by Esty Shapiro, who is here and will be talking through some of these slides, and was instrumental in the research.
Hi, all.
So first off, what is this research? So this is a project by CHR with really two purposes. The first is to understand the nature of housing discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression within the city of Pittsburgh, sort of a fact-finding mission, principally. And then B, to educate members of the LGBTQIA plus community on how to recognize and address housing discrimination and the role of CHR specifically. Obviously, many of you were, probably part of putting this RFP together and bringing this project into existence, but I found that dual nature of it really important. Just like what is actually happening out there. We're not seeing necessarily as many of the complaints as you might expect, is what we hear sort of anecdotally. So what's happening out there, and can we get people into the pipeline when they do face discrimination? Just as some like legal background, city law in Pittsburgh does include sexual orientation and gender identity and expression as protected classes. These are locally protected, have been sexual orientation since 1990, gender identity and expression since 2014, I believe. And so that precedes national protections. So in 2020, the U.S. Supreme Court in Bostock versus Clayton County interpreted sex discrimination in employment to include sexual orientation and gender identity. So basically, those categories, protected classes that were already protected in Pittsburgh, got interpreted into sex discrimination at a federal level. And then the Biden administration in 2021 sort of implemented that interpretation, across all aspects of civil rights law. So that's sort of how we got these protections here locally and nationally. And we conducted this research in reference to that legal context. We also didn't limit it to the specific legal context of the city of Pittsburgh and what's happening here. At a legal level, we wanted to keep the look broader, be open to the types of discrimination that people might share. So that was kind of in the background of our thinking always. Some notes on terminology as we head into this. Language is important. A lot of, I guess, like ink has been spilled around specific ways of talking about sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. That said, terms do evolve over time, and the community is not a monolith. It's actually many communities and many individuals who each have their own personal relationship with how they talk about their own sexual orientation, gender identity, expression. So moving forward with best intent, we're going to try to be reasonably nuanced in the way that we talk about these identities and how discrimination acts on them. But basically anything you say ever is going to not align with maybe someone's own personal understanding of themselves. So we want to just like grant ourselves grace as we move forward into this, but also as you interact with this content, particularly if you're coming from outside of these communities, we're like granting you grace as well. We know everyone here is trying to address this problem in good faith. Just to give some more context here, we don't always need to be this explicit, but I think we want to be as we move forward. There are legal definitions in the Pittsburgh City Code for sexual orientation and gender identity and expression. Those are important. You should refer back to those. Those are key in any case. But just moving forward here, like sexual orientation is a category of identity based on one's attraction to others. So it's about who you want to be with romantically, essentially. Whereas gender or sex identity categories, those are really about oneself. One's experience personally and socially of their body and their experiences. It gets a little tautological because it's gender or sex identity is your, experience personally and socially of your body and experience as a man, woman, or other non-man, woman person. but like that's sort of how it does work. And then gender expression is a related but separate idea, where it's the ways in which people act as a man, woman, or other identity in relation to time and place specific expectations. So it's helpful to pull these things apart. I'm happy to talk about them more if there's clarification that anyone wants. But suffice to say, there are like three different things, and all of which discrimination, can happen in relation to. Just for convenience sake, because there's a lot of things here, those get collapsed into like a set of identities and expressions called SOGI, if we're gonna like really shorthand it. Sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression, SOGI. I'm gonna say that word. It's not like a word that a lot of people really use in day-to-day life, but it is useful here as we talk about discrimination on all these three axes. And then, there's this iteration on an acronym that many, or if not all, are likely familiar with, LGBTQIA+. This is the way it's been implemented into Pittsburgh. There's the LGBTQIA+ Commission, shorthand for lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, asexual, and others. Other people have different ways of putting like long-handing that, but that's the shorthand that we're going to use here today. All right, so with all that kind of out of the way, let's talk about what this research actually, how we went about it. So first and maybe foremost, we just conducted interviews and had conversations, formal and informal. These are, Pittsburgh residents, people who were in the city as we were, there as well. These were survey respondents we held follow-up conversations with, social service providers. There's already an ecosystem of service providers catering to these communities or working with them consistently. And this also included a senior housing developer who's currently in the process of building an LGBTQIA+ friendly senior housing development. Beyond those interviews, we also held a mobile zine activity. This was an exhibit on fair housing and LGBTQIA+ history and geography in Pittsburgh. This exhibit also had like an activity where you could, with like pens and paper and cutouts of magazines and other fun things, you could sort of tell a story about your history with housing, your different housing experiences. This may or may not have included discrimination. This whole set of activities and exhibit that was up at the East Liberty branch of the library for 1 week in August, and then moved to the community center, QMNTY Center, Community Center, which is sort of a LGBTQIA+ focused community center in Allegheny West, I would say. That was up for about a month. We also had a survey, a relatively small online survey to get a general understanding of housing experiences and discrimination. This is a way we were trying to sort of reach an audience who maybe not be out and about, and get like kind of more granular understanding of what was happening. We'll go into the results of this and sort of more in that process in a bit. We also did tabling at public events. A lot of this was just getting the word out. Here's a thing that's happening. Here's CHR and how it can help you. We also had some kind of interactive activities like, where is queer home? Like, there's no government designated delineated neighborhood in Pittsburgh, as there is with some other cities. So it's really an open question, like, where do queer people feel comfortable and where don't they? And that was a really interesting process of like, okay, well, this is a really intersectional thing where some queer people feel comfortable in some places, others in other places. So we did this at Pride in late May, early June, and then also City in the Streets in Knoxville. All right, so I'm going to get into survey results here. I'm just going to preface this by saying this is a lot of information on the slides. This is too much information for you to absorb in this session, but I wanted you to have it in an easily accessible format moving forward. And just to be able to look at it yourselves now. So the survey was on an online platform called Typeform. It was available at this URL here, lgbtqia-rights.house. Participants were recruited at public events. We handed out business cards with the QR code. There was some news write-ups on it, social media. I know Rachel was sharing it a lot or Rachel's team was sharing it a lot on the CHR platforms, through online advertising at LGBTQIA plus focused websites and apps. It was viewed a lot, begun some number of times, and then we got 67 submitted responses, which gave us a lot of information to work with. And we were pretty happy with, given that it was a pretty long and intensive survey. It's not by any means a scientific survey. I guess we'll get into caveats in a minute, but it was enough to give us information to work with. Some demographics here. 84% of those respondents were current residents of Pittsburgh. 16% were former residents. It was not a racially and ethnically representative group. So it was 91% of respondents self-identified as white, 83% of those as white alone, and which is more than you would anticipate for the population of Pittsburgh if it was fully representative, and the communities of color were underrepresented. That we just kind of want to upfront that because we are likely underestimating experiences of discrimination because of that racial and ethnic respondent makeup. We sort of know that from the gate, from the start. We have 96% of the respondents were born in the US. 24% were first or second generation American. 100% native English speakers, though 12% spoke another language at home. And 48% had a disability of some kind. Of that group, 2/3, the disability was primarily related to mental health, and 13% had a service animal. Demographics from the perspective of sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. It was fairly diverse from that perspective. We did not have one group, one community within the set suite of communities overwhelming the responses. It was both on the axis of sexuality and sexual orientation, very diverse, and from gender identity and or sex, very diverse. 43%, kind of the call-outs that aren't in these two tables here, 43% said their gender identity differed from their gender assigned at birth, and 51% said their gender expression differed from what was expected of their gender assigned at birth. Some additional caveats here, not as we get into results, not every respondent answered every question. So we're going to be giving the responses for those that did. There was some tracking. If you answered some early questions, you got more in-depth questions later. We asked about all discrimination that happened in Pittsburgh or outside of it. And then we asked folks to flag when some or all of that discrimination happened in the city of Pittsburgh. And the results I'm going to show you here are for respondents who were discriminated against where some or all of those cases of discrimination were in the city of Pittsburgh. So we know from the responses in the survey and just anecdotally, a lot of people experience housing discrimination elsewhere and seek sanctuary essentially in the city of Pittsburgh. As we go through this here, the responses we're showing here, we're just showing folks who experience discrimination in the city, at least in some cases. And just underscoring this, survey was not scientific. This is not necessarily representative of the LGBTQIA plus experience in Pittsburgh. We're just showing you what the respondents said. And as we get into drill down insights, obviously the numbers get fewer. There less and less reliability in that representation. So right now, or whenever they answered this survey, responded to this survey, 34% of respondents owned, 57% rented, and 10% lived in sort of other circumstances, either with family and friends or in a shelter. And then, it's notable, basically, most respondents have rented. Many have tried to buy, either own or have tried to buy. More have tried to buy than say owned. And just the numbers here, I think, in terms of housing insecurity are notable. 16% have needed emergency housing, have been actively housing insecure, like acutely housing insecure. And then like 13% have been kicked out by family at some point in their life. This might not have been in the city of Pittsburgh, but at some point they had been kicked out by family. So I'd say we are dealing with a group that has some portion of that group is dealing with acute housing insecurity fairly often. Within ownership discrimination, so this is ownership, trying to purchase a home, when already owning a home, when getting home insurance or a mortgage or assessments or something like that. Our respondents said that explicit discrimination, where they saw experience any form of explicit discrimination, that was mostly in the listing or search process or as harassment that they're getting from, neighbors or others. Suspected discrimination, however, was more widespread and varied, where like a lot more respondents suspect they had been discriminated against, but have no like explicit proof of the matter. And um, you know, important to note here that we are asking about discrimination generally, and then asked how much of that discrimination do you think was primarily because of your sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression? And about half of those who had faced ownership discrimination said that they thought that SOGI, their sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression, was the main reason. Whereas also about half thought that it was some other protected class that was being discriminated against: race, sex, color, protective and cultural hair textures and styles and head coverings, domestic violence survivorship status, etc. So for rental market discrimination, any form of discrimination in really the housing rental market, again, more common and more varied. Harassment, again, the most common experience. And when I say harassment, we asked about various types of harassment, various parties. So landlords, managers, and staff was like sort of one category of harassment. Harassment by tenants in the same building was another, and then harassment by neighbors not in the same building was a third category. 73% of those facing renter discrimination thought that their sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression was the main reason for that discrimination. So housing insecurity and emergency housing. Again, this is a big, important issue in the LGBTQIA plus community. So we asked this two different ways, so I kind of give two different numbers here, but 16 to 18% of respondents experienced housing insecurity, acute housing insecurity, and had dealt with it through some sort of informal means. So by that I mean crashed with friends, slept in a car, like didn't go into the formal shelter system or emergency housing system. We asked about different ways that it happened. So really importantly, and Esty will touch on this more, is like that crashing is like a very important part of dealing with acute housing insecurity in this community, and having particularly non-family folks to crash with. Also just note, like, we have what seems to me like a very high rate of like trading, like bartering, for many goods and services, but then including sexual favors. So 6% of the respondents in the survey had sought space in an emergency shelter at some point. The majority of those, we're talking kind of small numbers here, the majority of those who had sought space in an emergency shelter had their sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression discussed negatively by staff. Half were refused space in the shelter. Half were made to stay in facilities that didn't align with their gender identity, and half were harassed by other residents. Sometimes that was addressed by the staff. So we also asked about transitional housing, I'll just note, but like we did not get enough responses on that to feel comfortable sharing without sort of potentially outing that person. We also asked about addressing discrimination. How did you deal with it when it happened? Was there an agency you went to? A majority of respondents facing discrimination could not address it in all cases. So they, either addressed it sometimes with the discriminating party, or other times just left that situation. Some of them left the living situation altogether. So about 1 in 5 facing discrimination left that living situation. And 8% the discrimination did not stop, but they also could not leave. We asked about different agencies that they had heard of. Most folks, or I guess the most amount of folks had heard of HUD, and had at least some understanding that there was an office in HUD that could potentially help them. And they'd also knew about neighborhood legal services. The rest, maybe a quarter to about a third, a little over a third, had heard of some of the other organizations, either public or nonprofit, in the area. And then just from a geographic level, here's a map of where respondents currently lived when they responded to the survey. We can see, we're talking small numbers here again, but there we see kind of like hotspots in Bloomfield and Shadyside, sort of downtown, Squirrel Hill, Oakland, Highland Park, Morningside. And then this is their past home neighborhood. When we say past, it's like when they lived in Pittsburgh previously, or earlier in their life, like where did they live? And we just asked them to check all the neighborhoods that applied. Kind of interesting here. Again, we're talking small numbers, but like the current residence reflects maybe a shift at some point to like downtown, Strip District, that part of town. Not surprisingly, where we saw discrimination was in a lot of cases where members of the LGBTQIA plus community live. So there is a reputation that Bloomfield and Shadyside are fairly friendly to this community. And so we, have a lot of members of that community moving to this area, but then also there are individual, landlords or others who are discriminating in those areas as well. Just note here, like, again, the numbers are low. So where we see these kind of, lighter colors, that doesn't necessarily mean those are a hot spot. We at least just got some report of discrimination in these areas. And this is for the rental market. So, maybe substantially similar, some other places popping up, Lawrenceville, CBD, some maybe interesting variations there, but again, low numbers, so really focusing on those like darkest areas. So now I'm going to pass it to Essie for maybe the more nuanced discussion of this, on getting into some of our qualitative findings that we came to through interviews and other conversations.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm Esty. I'm an associate with Outwith Studio, and yeah, just building off of what June has already shared, this is diving a little bit more into some of the short answer responses and some of the other qualitative themes that we saw emerging from the research. So both from the survey and then also expanding to include some of the conversations we had and some of the responses to the tabling or zine activity as well. There were a number of sort of more common and notable forms of discrimination that emerged. withholding of maintenance or maintenance neglect was one of the more common responses, and sort of brings up questions of how to prove intent, if the neglect is sort of just broad, or if there are really differences that residents can identify between how they're being treated versus other residents of the same building or same management. And so similarly, some of what people mentioned were privacy concerns, particularly in the rental market, and landlords having access to legal documents that may have different names or gender markers than the respondent uses in their life, and that sort of outing them, but then also changing how either landlords or realtors or other agents of the housing market treat them. There was a common discussion of a sort of vibe shift based on maybe an assumption or perception of someone's sexual orientation or gender identity that varied when they had only maybe been engaging via email or only used a certain name versus when they had other information. There were a sort of I don't want to say surprising, but unfortunate number of reports of really overt harassment, including the use of slurs, intentional and persistent misgendering, sexual assault by management or maintenance staff, spurious accusations, including involvement of law enforcement, which can, we know, statistically disproportionately harm various people of various gender identities and sexual orientations, and also people who hold other intersectional identities, including racial identities. And then some of the responses included anecdotes of tenants being asked to remove like a pride flag or other decorations when their neighbors perhaps had some other flag up that they suspected were based on their identities. And then withholding, sort of within the market as well, withholding security deposits. People reported instances of steering or sort of suspecting that they weren't being shown certain neighborhoods or areas that might have been available to them based on identity assumptions that a real estate agent, for example, made about their identity. And again, just the sort of differences in mode of communication, and when a search would go from email to in person, that often resulted in either a refusal to rent or an end to communication. Likely, based on what we've heard, the most common experience is harassment by neighbors, which opens a really broad question of responsibility. If the neighbor is renting in the same building, perhaps the landlord might be liable for some sort of relief to ending that discrimination. Or similarly, if two owners belong to the same condo association, or in an emergency shelter situation, staff can intervene. But a lot of the responses that we heard were from folks who were experiencing harassment by a neighbor who they didn't necessarily share a power structure, an overarching organization with. And so there's sort of limited relief available to them. And those were a lot of the responses we heard about not always being able to address discrimination as they experienced it. And sort of as June alluded to earlier, but definitely worth parsing out a little bit further, that acute housing instability, housing precarity in these communities is quite prevalent. And so the challenges specifically facing individuals seeking emergency housing and shelter are important. We heard from folks who actively avoid specific shelters based on what they know or their reputations regarding requiring people to stay in accommodations that don't align with their gender identity. There was some hesitation towards certain shelters with religious affiliations that had kind of a negative reputation. But then also outside of the formal system, that this informal network of care related to housing is really substantially supplementing that in these communities specifically. And so the prevalence of experiences of folks crashing, often with friends, but also respondents who, in describing their housing situations, described using their own sort of relative housing stability to subsidize or provide housing for others. And so individuals who said that they had sort of informally others staying with them as emergency housing, maybe not on their lease, or a homeowner who provides sort of pay what you can rooms to others who share various identities, or someone who exchanges care work for, say, the homeowner who maybe has a disability in exchange for subsidized housing, and so other maybe non-monetary arrangements. I'll just add, sort of beyond the Pittsburgh context, that there's also a really well-documented and rich history of this nationally, internationally, and across time, and that these informal networks are sort of critical to understanding LGBTQIA plus experiences of housing and housing discrimination and responding to harm. As we have sort of alluded to, mentioned in a couple different ways, we were often discussing discrimination broadly, and sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression were not always the most salient aspects of someone's identity where they felt that they experienced discrimination most acutely. And so we heard from a number of people with, perhaps not surprisingly in the housing space, a number of people with disabilities who felt that their disability and lacks of accessible housing, including mobility disabilities and physical, like ADA accessibility, but then also issues with landlords refusing service animals were really prevalent. And so that comes up. I think that's probably one of the more common sort of identities to experience housing discrimination, and that intersectionality we found was relatively large. And then also similarly, I think June mentioned this earlier, but a lot of respondents of color foregrounded racial discrimination sort of above their LGBTQIA identity. And so recognizing that that even within that community, which is not a monolith, that neighborhoods that some LGBTQIA plus folks might understand or have reputations as being sort of friendly towards them, that those also operate on axes of race and class that can be exclusionary to others, that these things sort of don't exist in isolation of one another. And similarly, we heard sort of blockbusting like statements or discriminatory real estate practices, respondents who just described that they suspected the value of their home was different or lower than other sort of neighboring areas based on the racial or ethnic demographics of the area, and suspected discrimination by things like mortgage lenders. Yeah, and then this was another sort of emerging theme that is beyond maybe what we immediately think of as being included within that protection for sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. But we heard from a number of individuals that their kind of non-normative family structures were a subject of discrimination or harassment. And so with the caveat that familial status is like a very specific thing in the fair housing context, and that essentially protects the presence of children under the age of 18. Within the LGBTQIA community, the term family can also be expansive and include not just family of origin, but also chosen family or other structures that may or may not be kind of legally recognized. And so if we can think a little expansively about what a family looks like, and separate this slightly from the familial status designation in the law, I think it's a question of how to identify. There were respondents who had experiences of discrimination related to the presence of children, right? Like that was a piece of it, that LGBTQIA plus people raising children received some form of scrutiny based on that, but also that family might include various intimate relationships that may or may not be legible to the current law.
Yeah,
I don't know if you want to jump in there.
I'll jump in and say there are other parts of the law, particularly family law, that have this sort of functional family outlook that provides a means of protections or sort of legal rights that certainly are different and more expansive than what we get in zoning law, but then also aren't really particularly covered in fair housing law either. And we can kind of triangulate them with or there's like a little gap. There's a gap. We have SOGI covered either explicitly in local law or interpreted into sex in federal law. And then we have presence of children covered under familial status. But then this question of like family structure, often including this presence of children question, how it relates to all you can kind of triangulate some discrimination protections from that in some cases, but not all. So yeah, it's not it's kind of a loose question, open questions like if we wanted to prevent that kind of discrimination, what legal protections will we change? Will we reinterpret what we mean by familial status to be something more expansive than how HUD defines it or how federal law defines it, and how current local law defines it? And then just to that question, just pointing out that like local law does think about family differently in different places. So under the discrimination article that, is applicable to CHR, we have this family status, which is essentially the presence of children, um, to collapse it a little bit. And then there is at another point, family and household members are defined, and this goes through all the, I guess, like normative ways we think about family of like blood, adoption, marriage, etc. And then there's this funny phrase of related by affinity, which is, I guess, like leaves open this more functional family definition that we see in family law. And it's just kind of a funny thing that is that a door to walk through maybe. And then just to note, under the zoning article, family includes up to three unrelated persons. Like that's the functional meaning of family in the zoning law. And how does that rub up against some great queer family structures? I mean, plenty of different types of family structures beyond just the LGBTQI community. But since that's what we're talking about, like that's a definitional concern. And then I can just close this out. Let's see.
Perfect.
So one thing we found is that like a lot of folks were not looking to pursue a remedy. They're like, this isn't, addressing this fair housing concern, this discriminatory landlord is not my top priority right now. I want to find safe housing and get to that, but I'm not going to sit through the legal process, investigative process, mediation, all that. And then we did hear of some cases where nonprofit legal service providers were seen as not taking the case or being dismissive of the person's experience. So even when trying to seek the remedy, finding pushback on that. And then I guess this is a detail to think about. There's lots of stories of people coming to Pittsburgh for relief from discrimination or hostile environment elsewhere. The persistent story throughout our conversations. Some of those folks describe feeling dejected by being immediately discriminated against when they sought housing in Pittsburgh, and just that's sort of an experience that we're seeing, and yeah, is important to highlight. One thing we also heard persistently is just the role of economics and class in all this, where folks are like, money is actually the thing that's gonna like is mediating a lot of this effective discrimination, where it's harder to make money as a queer person, particularly certain queer identities, particularly like intersectional identities. Like we know it's very hard to find a job as like a Black trans femme person, and like there's different versions of that. But harder to make money, harder to find an apartment or qualify, because like work can be more unstable or things like that. So and then compound that with the fact that the queer friendly places in the city are often like very expensive and gentrified. There's an implied or explicit understanding that some members of the community, for them, discrimination is less of a factor due to wealth, and as a function of race and gender identity expression. So like there's that funny mention before, steering to higher income areas, where like cis white gay men are are assumed to have just like a ton of money, and that's also like often true. So you get like less discrimination within that community, and which further marginalizes other parts of the community. And for cis white gay men who are poor, like that's also gets steering there. It's a very funny double-edged sword there. And then this all brings up questions of assimilation, and that gender expression part of the protection, where if we take the case of gay men, like really masc presenting gay men or really femme presenting lesbian women are going to have an easier time in the housing market than folks who don't assimilate to the wider culture. And I just say there's no specific neighborhood, as I mentioned before, but some neighborhoods are broadly thought of as friendlier than others, but those are very limited by race and class, and that's something we saw time and time again throughout the responses. All right, so I know we're running along here, but we weren't asked to give potential actions. This is not something where this is a fact-finding mission, but folks mentioned a lot of things that they would like to see done. So we just collated some of those and like our own insights here. So one is strengthen the relationships with existing orgs working in LGBTQIA plus communities. Not all of those organizations are like tied into the fair housing, civil rights, social service infrastructure. Iterate on communication pathways to these communities where, I think we had an interesting time trying to reach people. We found some methods successful, others less so. Just continuing to trying things and there's not going to be one communication method that works, but iterating a lot and seeing what's coming up. One thing that I don't know the feasibility of this, but it came up a couple times, maintaining and distributing a list of baseline decent landlords. So like, a good landlord list, that is something that is being informally kept already by some civil or some service organizations. And it's kind of informally distributed on like Facebook groups a little bit. But there's like also not really a central place to go looking. Creating a method of reporting and tracking suspected discrimination without initiating an investigation. And we heard folks did not have the time or mental capacity or effort to devote to being part of an investigative process. But even I think just CHR staff and the commission itself knowing where discrimination might be happening could be helpful. Continuing to educate landlords, including public and affordable housing landlords, about their responsibilities in this space. Finding some way to support the informal care and housing networks with funding or resources. There is some informal infrastructure already out there and not trying to replicate it, but supporting what already exists. And this is maybe you wrote, folks probably already know this, but increasing pairs testing capacity to run investigations and do things proactively instead of waiting for the complaints. Thank you for listening. Happy to answer questions, though I know we talked a lot. So thanks.
Thank you both so much. I don't know if anyone wants to. I know I'd like to be able to share the slides if you're comfortable with that, so that the commissioners can take a little bit longer to sit with the information and process. I do think it would be worth discussing at our next community relations committee meeting and seeing where we'd like to go from here, and maybe even including you all in some of the planning for the exhibit or the public presentation that we're looking to have. But if anyone has anything now they'd like to mention.
Thank you so much for your presentation.
Yeah, there was general acclaim for the presentation happening in the commissioner text thread while you were speaking. So yeah, thank you so much. This was it was really eye-opening. And I feel like despite the relatively low and not scientifically representative responses that we had to the project, I'm actually pleasantly surprised by the number of responses that we did wind up getting, and by the sort of wealth of information that's either supplied or suggested in the results that you've reported. And so I feel like this gives us a lot of potential avenues for future work, and for kind of deepening our connections across the community so that we can work to repair the breaches that you've discovered. So I'm really grateful for what you've shared.
I found it very interesting. What I found interesting that I mentioned earlier is just the amount of real estate transactions that were assumed to be discriminatory, because that's not something that we see at the commission. I can't tell you any complaints that I can recall that had to do with an actual like purchase of a home, anything to having to do with lending, or maybe even direct steering. I mean, maybe some of our investigators would remember, but that's a space that we're looking to get into now, the appraisal space, the purchasing lending space, and the supportive financing that you can get through certain programs and what's happening there as well. So yeah, a lot of really good things for us to think about in the next year. And I definitely want to be able to do more with like Fair Housing Month with this project. Yeah, thank you all for your time and attention, because this has been a long time coming. I really appreciate both June and Esty for they've come out. They did Pride with us this year, and they've been out to set up the zine activity, and it's really cool to see some of the things that come out of these projects, and just the perspectives that you just don't normally get an opportunity to see. Well, I'll jump us back into our agenda, but yeah, please let me know if you think of any additional questions or anything for Out With, and then we can get back in touch with them and see if we can get anything answered for everybody, or if there's something else that we want to do moving forward. Sorry. Trying to get
Something to drink there. That was really a good presentation. Thank you so much for that. I did screenshot. I don't know if y'all was paying attention. Like I screenshotted a couple of the slides because I really couldn't see them, like I said, but I wanted to get a closer look at it later. So the fact that you're going to send it out to us, I appreciate that. So with that, I think that was what old business. So we're at new business. Is there any new business to report? No. So I guess we're at adjournment. So would anybody like the motion for adjournment?
A motion to adjourn.
I'll second and echo all the thanks to Out With. We really, really appreciate it. What an amazing presentation.
Yeah. Excellent job, Esty and June.
Yes, it was great.
And excellent job, team, getting the word out. So good.
I guess there's no extensions. Anyone want to stay on here? I guess this meeting can be adjourned.